Wood and Teeth, a podcast about truth-telling on politics and health. I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today's truth. More Americans than ever are consuming wellness information on social media, and I think this has contributed to the rise of the Make America Healthy Again movement, which is essentially led by our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. If you're consuming this podcast, you've probably become familiar with some of MAHA's signature issues like getting rid of food additives and avoiding seed oils. Today, I'd like to examine MAHA through both a scientific and a political lens. Is there evidence to support these public health initiatives? And who exactly supports MAHA's agenda? We're going to address these topics with a great guest, Dr. Jessica Knurick, a registered dietitian with a PhD in physical activity, nutrition, and wellness, and she has spent the last decade working on the wellness side of healthcare in the research lab, in clinical care, and with innovative medical tech startups aimed at improving the health of individuals. She's also big on social media. Maybe you've heard of her. Here is my conversation with Dr. Knurick. Dr. Knurick, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So let's talk about MAHA. It's been a really interesting component of President Trump's coalition that I think probably capitalizes on the growth in the wellness space on social media. A poll, which I'm going to share with you right now, that was conducted by YouGov right after the 2024 election, had some really interesting data on this. It showed huge growth when it came to both Democrats and Republicans' consumption of wellness information on social media. The trends are the same regardless of party, and it's significant. Back in 2022, only 18% of Americans consumed this sort of content on social media. Fast forward to 24, and that's jumped to about a third of Americans. And so you know a thing or two about this space. You've got nearly 1 million followers on Insta. And bring us into that world. What is it like? Is it bifurcated by party? Are there different pockets? What's the landscape look like?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I think that the landscape has evolved and changed over time, especially in the last 4 years, and especially in the last 1 year. I do think that wellness used to be a bit more left-leaning, if I had to put up into a single bucket. Certainly like the old school crunchy, right? Which I fell into back in the early days, was definitely more left-leaning. But I think we've seen quite the evolution in the wellness space. And now I would definitely say it's probably kind of even. I'm sure that a lot of us want to be well. Now on social media, it seems to be a bit more overrepresented right now, kind of leaning right, which is definitely an evolution that's happened over the last few years.
And as a dispenser, if you will, of evidence-based information on public health, do you get more hate or more like? It's social media, so you're always going to get some hate, right? But what's your experience been like on the receiver end of comments?
I put myself into a position where I get way more because I don't read my comments much.
Healthy.
So I read my DMs, and my DMs are overwhelming. As much as I can, and they're overwhelmingly 98% positive, which is wonderful. I imagine my comment section is a bit different, but I stopped reading that for my own mental health after about the first hour of posting.
That might be the most important public health information that we share.
Yeah.
This entire podcast.
It's good practice for those of you who are content creators, I'll tell you.
So let's talk about some of the signature proposals from the Make America Healthy Again agenda from an evidence-based health perspective. Food dyes. I've heard a lot about food dyes, and RFK Jr. has applauded legislation, for example, in West Virginia that removes certain food dyes from school lunches. Out in Texas, the Attorney General has announced that his office is launching an investigation into WK Kellogg Company for marketing its products as healthy despite containing, and this is a quote, petroleum-based artificial food colorings that have been linked to hyperactivity, obesity, autoimmune disease, endocrine-related health problems, and cancer in those who consume them. He cited cereals such as some of my childhood favorites, Fruit Loops, Apple Jacks, Frosted Flakes, and Rice Krispies. So, should we be concerned about food dyes?
I think food dyes have been, for the MAHA movement, this very easy to latch onto issue. So it's been a very galvanizing issue for the MAHA movement. It's easy to remember when you hold up the Fruit Loops with the synthetic food dyes versus the natural food dyes, paints a very clear picture of the difference. When you look at the actual science of food dyes, it's very interesting for me to be talking about this because I am not pro food dye by any means. But if you look at my content where I correct a lot of this misinformation coming out about food dye, you could make that jump to that conclusion that, oh, she just loves food dye, which I absolutely do not. And as somebody who has a PhD in nutrition science and, is a dietitian, like food dyes are found in ultra processed foods. They're found in these high sugar, ultra processed foods, right? That's where we're seeing food dyes. And so I am all for reducing our intake of these high sugar, ultra processed foods where we tend to find food dyes, like in Skittles and things like that. But when you look at the actual science around food dyes and the amount that we are actually exposed to in our foods, there is just not strong evidence that it is this harmful ingredient that everyone is talking about. There's a little bit of evidence that in a small subset of people with kids with ADHD, it can exacerbate symptoms of ADHD in those children. And so that's definitely an area of study that it's important to keep looking into. It's very difficult with that research to parse out, is it the actual dye or is it the foods that, a lot of parents anecdotally will say, when I took my kids off of food dye, they just were so much better. But is it the dye or is it that if you stop giving your kids food dye, you're not giving them Skittles and all of these candies and High C and, I don't want to keep naming names and then get sued or anything, but all of these foods that have these artificial food dyes are also these high sugar, nutrient devoid a lot of time foods. And so it's hard to parse out what it is exactly. Are you removing Skittles and then giving them Giggles, right? Which are the natural dye you can buy them at the grocery store, which also is another point of this. It's positioned almost in a way that we don't have any choice in the matter. And I talk about systems all the time, and that's true, or there's aspects of that are true. But you can go to the grocery store right now. I mean, I can go to King Soopers right down the road from me, which is our Kroger here in Denver. And, you have options. You can get Fruit Loops, or you can get, I think it's called Fruitful O's. And that's the natural dyed version. And they were the same price. I mean, I priced them out. Actually, the Fruitful O's were a bit cheaper, which was interesting. So we do have those options. But when you're looking at the science, there's just not evidence that these dyes are causing issues as they're portrayed in the media.
What about the broader proposition that we allow too many additives, artificial additives, in food here in the US versus other countries, like say in the EU, and that is contributing to our health decline? Is there some truth to that? No truth to that? Where do you stand?
A lot of times this claim gets made, and there's this comparative number that they use, 10,000 to 400. I don't know if you've heard that claim. We certainly do have more additives in the US. It's not that extreme, but we certainly do have more. Again, there's no evidence to suggest that those additives are causing our health conditions. There's no evidence for that. I'm someone who likes to look at a more precautionary approach to our food additives, and I've always been this way. So I mean, for the last 15 years since I've been doing this, I've recommended that we take a more precautionary approach. Having said that, that gets us into a little bit of these regulatory differences between us and Europe and these other countries where, in the US we take a risk-based approach, and in Europe they take more of a precautionary approach to their food additives, and leads to differences in how we regulate. But in terms of we allow too many, I don't know. I mean, that's the honest answer. The thing about MAHA is we spend so much time talking about these preservatives and emulsifiers and color agents and natural flavorings and things like that, where it's such a small piece of the puzzle when we're talking about the overall health of the US, which is what frustrates me the most about this movement, I think, is that even in my conversations and these kind of conversations, we spend so much time on these additives. And I do think it's an important thing to talk about. And I wrote a whole article about grass and closing the grass loophole. That's somewhere I align with the RFK Jr. But it's just not it's
Sorry
just
to
not
sidetrack you.
Yeah, we could talk about that, but it's just not a huge piece of the overall puzzle when we look at our health. Anyone who's been in this field, actually studying chronic disease in this country and actually studying health in this country for years, knows that that's just not a big piece of the puzzle. It's far more clear to us what the pieces are, and we can talk about that as well.
You've piqued my curiosity. What's the grass loophole?
So GRAS is a determination that we have in the United States called generally recognized as safe. And it's one of the reasons that we have so many of these food additives in our food environment. Do you know what that is now that I said it?
No,
Yeah.
this is all new to me. Thank you.
Okay.
This is as enlightening for me as perhaps any audience member here. So thanks.
Yeah, so I think what gets a little confused is some of the ingredients that are talked about on social media that are like the most concerning for people, particularly like the food dyes, right? They are not GRAS designated. They have to go through FDA approval. They have to go through like the whole process and get approved for use. GRAS is a different designation. It started out with good intent back in, I believe, the 50s. And it started out basically because the FDA was having to approve all of these additives. And so they wanted a designation that said, okay, well, things like flour and sugar and salt, they don't need to go through this like extensive FDA process because they're generally recognized as safe, right? We've been consuming these for ever. And so they get this designation. So that became a designation. From then until 1997, in order to get an ingredient generally recognized as safe, in order to go through that designation, you still had to go through the FDA. It just went through a different kind of process. It was a little bit different than like food dyes. And then you would get your designation as generally recognized as safe. Well, in 1997, in the 80s and 90s in the US, there was this huge deregulatory push, right, in pretty much all areas, including under the Clinton administration. What happened was at the FDA, they didn't have the resources, which is a common theme over the last 4 or 5 decades, to basically, there were so many food additives coming into the system that, all these corporations wanted to use, and the FDA couldn't keep up with that. So there was this giant backlog. And so what the FDA did is they said, okay, we are going to basically allow corporations to self-affirm these ingredients as safe. And so that became self-affirmed GRAS, or a self-affirmation process. And that gets misconstrued a little bit to say, oh, companies were just adding anything and they didn't even know what they were adding in, which isn't necessarily true. The companies still had to go through that same process the FDA was going through, but they got to hire their own scientists to do it. And they got to kind of like hire their own people, which, that's never the optimal thing when a corporation is regulating itself. But the whole idea was, okay, well, it's in these companies' best interest to not put in unsafe foods, and they have to show that there's evidence of safety, like in the literature. And so we're going to let them self-affirm. So that's how it's been since 1997. It's a very pro-industry kind of approach. RFK Jr. has mentioned that he wants to close the loophole. The only problem is that we've cut many, many scientists from the FDA and cut about a third of the food division. So you can't kind of do that and close the GRAS loophole at the same time. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, which, we'll talk a lot about with MAHA.
So we've talked about the stuff we add to our food. Let's talk about what we add to our water, specifically fluoride. Utah just became the first state to ban adding fluoride to the water supply. RFK Jr. wants to see this happen nationwide. Before I ask you about the science, let's just look at the politics. We at Healthier Colorado polled this issue just after the election in 2024. And this is what we found in terms of support for adding fluoride to the water supply. There's still a majority of voters here in at least this state who supports doing so. But you do see a partisan split here between Democrats and Republicans on the issue. And you also see a split when it comes to age. Older folks who grew up with this tend to support it more than younger folks. So there's a slice of the politics. What about the science? Should we continue to add fluoride to the water supply?
I do want to give a caveat that I'm a nutrition scientist, and so fluoride kind of it's not necessarily a nutrient that sustains us. So having said that, though, just from kind of a public health perspective, fluoride in water helps to prevent tooth decay. It helps to prevent dental caries in children and adults, but it's most important in children. And the number one chronic disease in the United States, which I think will surprise a lot of people, is dental caries in children. So, I polled this actually on my Instagram the other day and asked, like, what do you guys think the number one chronic diseases in the country? The most common chronic disease in the US is dental caries. Almost nearly 20% of children have it. And so if we're talking about preventing chronic disease in children, and we look at what is the number one chronic disease in children, which is dental caries, and the best public health measure that we have to prevent dental caries is water fluoridation. I mean, the CDC has data still it's up on their website, that community water fluoridation reduces tooth decay by 25% in populations. And in some populations, it's even higher than that, because we know that it disproportionately helps low-income populations, right? People who don't have access to regular dental care. And, even those of us who do have access to regular dental care, like myself, I have private insurance. When I go to the dentist, it costs me $50 for a fluoride treatment. So I have to pay an out-of-pocket $50, and they'll just kind of ask me, do you want a fluoride treatment? It's an extra $50. Well, what percentage of people are going to say no to that, right? An extra $50 for fluoride treatment, especially if they don't really recognize the importance of it. Water fluoridation helps to kind of protect, and you kind of mentioned that split where like older people support it more than younger people. I mean, well, you can just think about my grandmother had a whole mouth of dentures when she was younger, and we don't see that anymore. And a big reason for that is water fluoridation. If you are brushing your teeth every day with fluoridated toothpaste and you are going to the dentist and you're getting fluoride treatments, you're likely going to be fine. So taking fluoride out of water will disproportionately negatively impact low-income populations. And we'll see a rise in dental caries and a rise in the most common chronic disease in children.
Here's one that has really caught my attention lately with the increased demand for beef tallow. That is seed oils. RFK Jr. has claimed that Americans are being, quote, unknowingly poisoned by seed oils. Restaurants like the salad chain Sweetgreen have removed them from their menus. More and more Americans are saying that they're avoiding seed oils. Should we be concerned from a health perspective about seed oils?
With the food dyes one, it's nuanced, right? Like that's a nuanced conversation. It's overstated for sure, but we can talk about how there is some evidence that in kids with ADHD, like I talked about, with seed oils, this really just flies in the face of nutrition science research. I had never even heard of the term seed oils. We don't use that in nutrition science. We use polyunsaturated fatty acids. We talk about vegetable oils is what they have been termed, or we talk about the individual oils. And just to kind of like define it, seed oils are the oils that come from seeds. So things like sunflower and safflower and soybean, all of these different like seeds are seed oils. But again, we've always called those vegetable oils. So if you go and you like buy vegetable oil, those are going to have seeds, quote unquote, seed oils in them. We just have so much data to show that increased intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids is cardioprotective. And there's also good data to show that when you swap out saturated fat and you replace it with polyunsaturated fat, that it improves markers of cardiovascular disease. It improves all-cause mortality. There was just a study that came out a couple of months ago, a huge study in hundreds of thousands of people that looked at this and showed improvement in all-cause mortality when you substituted butter and replaced it with quote-unquote seed oils and other polyunsaturated fatty acids. The assertion that seed oils are poisoning us is just not rooted in evidence. There's no evidence to suggest that. The thing that I will say with seed oils is that they are cheap. They're a very cheap oil, especially when you compare them to like olive oil or avocado oil. I mean, you can just think if you go to the store and you see them on the shelf, like how much cheaper vegetable oil is, which is seed oils. And so because they're cheap and they're quite flavorless compared to like an olive oil, for example, they're used in these ultra-processed foods. And ultra-processed foods dominate our food environment. Estimates have them at about 70% of our food environment. Because of that, we tend to overconsume these seed oils because we're overconsuming ultra-processed foods. And the overconsumption of anything is going to be detrimental, is going to be harmful for us. It's not necessarily because it's the seed oils, it's because we're overconsuming oils. I mean, a thing that I see a lot is this comparison of America to other countries. And people will compare us to like Japan and say Japan is so much healthier. They have a 4% obesity rate and better health outcomes than us. Well, I don't think people realize seed oils are used all around the world. And the most common oil used in Japan is canola oil. They call it rapeseed oil, but we call it canola oil. So it's not that these seed oils are causing us health issues. It's that we're overconsuming seed oils, we're overconsuming fat, we're overconsuming calories in general, which is really, really the issue here.
Junk food. I think we both agree that junk food, ultra-processed foods and sodas are not good for you, right? But MAHA has made a specific point of calling for restrictions of junk food when it comes to SNAP benefits. RFK Jr. wants to ban soda from SNAP benefits. We polled this one as well in December among Colorado registered voters and found that it's pretty much a 50-50 issue. Overall, it was 49 support, 43 opposed. There was actually a very small partisan split. It was almost within the margin of error but the support increased as you went up the income scale. Again, I'm sure you agree that like drinking a lot of sugary soda, not healthy. But what do you think about the policy in terms of effective population health promotion?
This topic has been long debated in public health, these restrictions on SNAP. So, SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It helps roughly 42 million people in the United States every year. It's the number one program that we have to help people out of poverty. I think in 2021, it lifted 2.4 million people out of poverty in this country. I don't think that people realize how successful SNAP is. It's an incredibly successful program. It directly reduces food insecurity by 30%. Also, in terms of participation, 80% of people on SNAP are people who have children, people who are elderly, or people with disabilities. I think we have this like kind of image in our brain about SNAP just because of media narratives. Every study that's ever been done on this has shown very little fraud in the 1 to less than 1% range, and that's illegal. Fraud is illegal. So if they're caught, they lose their benefits. I think that what gets lost in this is just the success of SNAP. Even economically, in terms of economic success, every dollar that goes into SNAP produces $1.50 to $1.80 in economic activity, in local economic activity. And so this is a very successful, efficient program. And when we talk about restrictions on SNAP, I'm actually not against the idea of talking about in a genuine way potential SNAP restrictions. And there's some data that SNAP recipients aren't necessarily against that either. But what I would like to see is a thoughtful discussion on that. And that's not what we're seeing play out in the media. It's very interesting to me to talk about this goal of restricting soda from SNAP. You got to think about like what that actually looks like in practice. So we're going to restrict soda. Well, what if someone's drinking Diet Coke? And that's like, they just love their Diet Coke each day. And then you're going to take that. And people think like, oh, it's supplemental, but 40% of SNAP recipients receive the maximum benefit. That means that they don't have extra money at the end of the month to spend on other groceries. So it's not supplemental for them. These are their groceries. So let's say they have a Diet Coke every a couple days. And then you take that away from them. And then they're like, okay, I'm going to drink High C now. Well, that's not a good switch, right? That's not something that we would like to see. What happens is we don't have good data on what will it look like in practice. Will that actually meaningfully improve someone's diet quality, or will it actually worsen someone's diet quality? In 2023, I think it was, Cory Booker and Marco Rubio, they put forth bipartisan legislation to study this, to see, okay, in a meaningful, in a genuine way, if we restrict soda on SNAP, for example, what will that outcome data look like? Now, that bill never got out of committee, unfortunately, which most bills don't, but that's something that I support. Let's study it in a meaningful way. What I don't support is just saying, let's just completely take this away, while also, by the way, cutting billions of dollars from SNAP. Because what happens is that doesn't really look like you're trying to help these people. That looks more like control to me. I don't really love that framing. And that's also been a long time concern of a lot of people in this space who actually understand SNAP in this program, is that these restrictions can kind of like open the door to more restrictions and more cuts, because at the end of the day, a lot of people would like to see SNAP benefits cut. So that's kind of the hesitation in being like, okay, yeah, let's cut SNAP. The only data that we have is simulation data, and that doesn't help us in terms of seeing like, what does a person actually do? If they no longer can purchase their Diet Coke, what are they going to purchase instead? I just want meaningful discussions about this, and that's not what happens right now in the media and on social media.
So I'd like to end by taking a big picture look at your concerns and your hopes. Let's start with your concerns about MAHA. What are you most concerned about with this movement?
You started our conversation talking about how you showed that graph and how so many more people are interested in consuming this kind of content. And that has certainly been my experience on social media. My account's grown significantly in the last 6-7 months. And I'll say it's because people are just more interested who maybe never were, and especially about policy, which I talk about a lot. I try to kind of like connect how policy is impacting our food supply and our overall health and public health. I do think that there is room for us to reach these people. But at the same time, my concern is that we don't have as many science communicators on social media. And for better or worse, social media is where people are going to get their information. Most of the narrative is dominated in the wellness space, and people who they've never worked in public health. They've never worked with SNAP. They've never been in science. They've never done research, right? Many, many people are coming to this and they're very interested, but the only narrative that they're hearing is one side of it. And they're not hearing a real evidence-based side from a lot of these issues, or a really nuanced side from a lot of these issues. Because it's really easy to hear soda is awful for you. Of course we should restrict that. I don't want our benefits going to like paying for soda and helping the soda industry. So if that's all you're hearing, and then you see someone like me saying, okay, well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. You have to consider all of these things when you're talking about restrictions. If that's the first time you're hearing like a counterpoint, it's really easy to write me off as like pro soda, right? Or like bought off by the soda industry. Or when, by the way, I'm definitely absolutely not pro soda, not pro soda industry. I think that that's something that we're struggling with right now. And we need to figure out a way to get more science communicators out there, more public health experts out there. But, a lot of public health experts who are working in public health, they can't speak out. And so we're at a real disadvantage in terms of being able to get out evidence-based information so that people can hear a counterpoint. I hear from people all the time who are like, oh my gosh, you're the first person I've ever heard talk about these issues in a different way. And that's not great that I'm the first time they've heard it, That's something that I would say I'm a little concerned about.
Let's talk about your hopes, and I'm going to cue you up with one last piece of polling data from that post-election YouGov poll of Americans. And if you're listening to this podcast, we're also on YouTube, so I'll share the data visually, but also kind of walk listeners through what I'm showing here, which is, again, a poll done by YouGov just after the 2024 election. And I actually found some hope in this poll in terms of large-scale agreements between Democrats and Republicans on a range of interesting health issues. For example, 84% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans think that we should require nutrition education in federally funded medical schools, for example. There's widespread support for banning certain food additives, funding for alternative and holistic approaches to health, increasing restrictions on the use of pesticides in agriculture, actually banning processed foods from school lunch. That gets 68 among Democrats, 66 among Republicans. There were actually a large number of health issues on which a majority of both Democrats and Republicans agree. Do you find hope in this? And more broadly, what are you most hopeful for in this chapter of health politics?
I do find hope in this. I have also found this in my personal life, just being a content creator during this time. I kind of mentioned that my account has grown significantly over the last 6, 7, 8 months. And that to me shows, and you kind of showed it with data, people are very interested in this, people who may have never been before. One thing I can say about the MAHA movement is they've tapped into something in people on both sides of the aisle, people who just want a healthier America, which is something that I think many of your listeners, myself, people who've been working in the space for so long, we all want a healthier America. So I do think that this is a really big opportunity for us if we can figure out how to explain in a really clear way, okay, our food environment is 70% ultra-processed food. Why is it like that? Why have we gotten to this place? And what needs to happen to get us out of this place? And that is a bit more nuanced than just saying big food is corrupt and let's go after big food. It's certainly much more systemic than that. And so helping people to understand that, which is what I try to do with my platform, and obviously there's an interest in it. So I'm very hopeful that if we can help to get people to see how policy connects, because, I used to hear all the time when I would talk about these issues, food shouldn't be political. And, as somebody who studies the policy of food, right, and like how policy connects to our food environment, that doesn't make any sense to me. But I don't hear that as much anymore. And so I do think that maybe people are starting to recognize, oh, policy does connect. And I think that's a huge opportunity. Like if we can help people to understand, then we can get people on both sides of the aisle to push our legislators to actually do things for public health, right? Because for so long, there hasn't been this big desire to fund public health initiatives. And it's been much more so, let's help corporations, right, get richer. People have a lot of power in this country, especially if we can band together. We just need to not let the narrative get manipulated and help people to actually see the reality of like how policy is connected to this to get people motivated for action.
Great place to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Knurick. This has been enlightening.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
You can learn more about Dr. Knurick's work at jessicaknurick.com. That's with a K, Knurick. And you can find all of her social handles there. Thanks for listening, and please rate and subscribe.